Right. So, hi, Nicholas. And
Hello.
my first question for you was, when did you first become involved in the counterculture and occult underground?
Well, I would say I was born into the counterculture in that my parents were very much on the front line of the psychedelic and sexual revolution in the 60s. My father was already experimenting with LSD and mescaline when it was still legal in the early 60s. So I was born into the counterculture. As far as the occult renaissance and revival, as I was growing up in the early 60s, it was all around me, and I was completely influenced by it, embraced it, and already began studying all of that at a very early age. So I didn't know anything but the counterculture growing up. That was the social milieu that I grew up in, and I was raised to be an iconoclast and to be outside of the system. I didn't have to rebel against anything because I was born into a familial network of rebellion. So, yeah, I wasn't even aware of the square or straight world. So I think that succinctly answers your question.
Yeah. And how can you tell us how you came to know Anton LaVey and Kenneth Anger?
Kenneth Anger, I met at the 70th birthday party of Forrest J. Ackerman, who was a science fiction pioneer, and he was the editor of a magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland. He invited me to his 70th birthday party, which was held at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. And Kenneth Anger came up to me and my drummer from Radio Werewolf and said, strangely enough, he said, "I'm looking for Neil Jordan, who is the director of The Company of Wolves," which was a movie that came out a few years earlier. And strangely, we were Radio Werewolf. So we were a company of wolves. And I began talking to Kenneth. He followed me into the bathroom he wanted to share a joint with me, which I did not accept that invitation. And he talked about Radio Werewolf to me. And it's tied into LaVey in that Kenneth was sending clippings of Radio Werewolf advertisements and posters and reviews to Anton in San Francisco, who he, of course, knew. So when I met Anton in February of 1988, uh, LaVey already knew what my work was because Kenneth had been sending him clippings about it, because Kenneth would send Anton clippings of bizarre or macabre or occult things routinely, little care packets. So I met Anton in 1988 because I was doing a book called The Demonic Revolution, which I never published ultimately because I was very disenchanted with the occult world. So Anton, I met under the auspices of interviewing him in February of 1988. And I have to point out again, as I have many times, I was in no way enamored of the Church of Satan. I did not believe in his atheistic approach to diablerie. I had a very different approach to occultism and devil worship than Anton did, but we became friends because of my contacting him to interview him. He came over to my house with Blanche Barton, and we became friends, but under the auspices of my interviewing him, which I did many times, going to the Black House in the middle of the night and interviewing him for this book, and ultimately unraveling the degree of his prevarications and exaggerations and Baron Munchausen lies. So I think that and then I got to know Kenneth much better too, because he was Zena's godfather, and we would see him often in Los Angeles for years to come. So I knew Kenneth from 1987 is when I first met him at Forey's party. And the last time I saw him, bringing things full circle, was 1999 at another Forrest Ackerman party.
And just want to explain briefly the photos here. That this is Kenneth Anger's house. Bobby is standing outside, isn't it?
Yes. The picture of me and Kenneth there is from 1990, shortly before we moved to Vienna, Austria. We took him out to dinner at Nicodel Restaurant, which was a famous old Hollywood restaurant near Paramount Studios, near Valentino Place, where I used to live, and near what is now Hollywood Forever Cemetery. So it was a very Hollywood Babylon place to meet him. And it was sort of a farewell dinner before we moved to Vienna, Austria. The other picture is Bobby Beausoleil in 1967, when he was living with Kenneth at the Westerfield House, which was then known as the Russian Embassy. And then the picture next to it, I'm recreating his pose at the Westerfield House while I was filming my documentary there a few years ago. And you will notice behind Cupid is Crowley's motto, the Thelemic motto. And that was not, it isn't that Bobby really believed in Thelema or was a great follower of Crowley. That was because of Kenneth Anger's obsession with Crowley.
Yeah, and we can kind of segue into the next question from this, because obviously eventually you married Zena LaVey. She became Zena Schreck, didn't she? And as she said, Zena was Kenneth Anger was her godfather.
Correct.
And so she told you about things she remembered from her childhood about Ken talking about Bobby.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about that? Yeah.
Is that what you're asking? What did she say about
that?
What
did she say about Bobby? Because she remembers what happened back in the 60s.
Well, when Zena was a little girl growing up in the Black House, Kenneth was always there in San Francisco, and he would rant and rave about his new boyfriend and boy toy and crush, Bobby Beausoleil, who was a musician. Now, she didn't meet him, but she knew the name Bobby Beausoleil because Kenneth was like a giggling schoolgirl. He was totally in love with Bobby Beausoleil at that time in 1967. And she was also aware of their breakup when Beausoleil left. But it wasn't any big deal. This was Kenneth Anger's ordinary life. So, but the LaVeys and Zena had heard the name of Bobby Beausoleil long before he became infamous because of the Hinman murder. And also at the same time, there was a kind of flaky, strung out young lady named Susan Atkins, who went under the name Sharon King at the time as a go-go dancer and stripper. And of course, she did visit the Black House and was there.
I never knew that. She called herself Sharon before. That's a weird synchronicity, isn't it? Oh, yeah.
Sharon King was her stripper name. Yeah. So Anton hired her to be in this thing called Anton LaVey's Topless Witches Review. And she performed this vampire act. And so she hung around a little bit, but also, like Beausoleil was not a serious follower of Thelema or Aleister Crowley, nor was Susan Atkins a follower of the Church of Satan. She was just there because Anton managed to get
the poster behind you while we're talking about Bobby. Tell me about the poster behind you. Yeah.
Behind me. So anyway, the point is Zena knew the name Susan Atkins, Bobby Beausoleil, as early as 1967. And that was the year that she, became notorious by being baptized in this satanic baptism that was covered all around the world.
Yeah, there's photos of it I've seen. Yeah, there's like press photos, isn't there? Yeah.
Right. So behind me is a poster for a performance that Kenneth Anger did with Bobby. It's the only time they actually managed to collaborate. And it was the Magic Powerhouse of Oz, which was Bobby's band at the time. And Kenneth Anger did a ritual performance at the Straight Theater in San Francisco. And some of that you can see in the film Invocation of My Demon Brother. You can see the part of the performance of Kenneth waving a swastika flag around and doing a Crowley imitation. And Invocation of My Demon Brother was what remained of Anger's first attempt to make the film Lucifer Rising. The most interesting thing about that performance, one, it led to this fight between Kenneth and Bobby, which led to Beausoleil fleeing, where he was, staying with Kenneth at the Russian embassy, the picture that I showed you before. And he ended up going from the clutches of one gay guy who had, a crush on him, to Gary Hinman's house in Topanga Canyon, which seemed to be the same situation. And I think it's important to understand that probably if Kenneth and Bobby had stayed together and Bobby had not fled to Topanga Canyon from San Francisco, probably this whole nightmare would not have developed the way it did. So I think that episode is very important in the what if.
So many things like that about this case. When Tex overdosed on what we now know as Datura, they thought it was belladonna, but they were taking a much stronger variant of the plant. And
Right.
if he had been put in the mental hospital when that happened, but he just got arrested and thrown in a cell and then let go again when he sobered up, if he had actually gone into the mental hospital like he should have, this probably would have never happened as well.
Right. Charlie told me that after that trip, where he was famously arrested, climbing down the sidewalk, going beep, beep, beep.
Yeah.
And that's why they had a fingerprint of him, because of that arrest. Otherwise, they could have a criminal record despite his robbery and drug dealing activity. But yeah, there are so many what ifs. If this hadn't happened, if it hadn't happened. As Gene Gutowski told me, if Roman Polanski had not let Wojtek Frykowski into a party that was held at the Łódź Film Institute in 1957, Gene Gutowski told me none of this would have ever happened. That friendship, that fatal friendship that lasted until Frykowski's demise, is how he saw the cause of it. But one final thing about the Straight Theater poster behind me. Who paid for this performance, interestingly, was the patroness of the arts, Abigail Folger, who knew Charlie and Susan even then, although Bobby did not know Manson yet at the time. That's important to point out. I think there's some confusion about when they met. They didn't meet until LA, but Abigail Folger was already involved with the network of people that ultimately led to her.
And this is one thing that they cover up about this case, is the fact they actually knew their victims, the Manson family.
Yeah.
Well, they make out they murdered strangers, but you can't forget what they did.
Folger knew Susan Elkins as early as 1967, when Susan was going to the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic to get treated for her many sexually transmitted diseases. And that is what's important about the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, not this absolute fictional nonsense about MK Ultra or any of that bullshit. So
they were studying them, but if you look at it, they didn't even know what they were meant to be recording. The people that were watching the people tripping in that flat down the road from Haight-Ashbury, it was not organized. They were studying people, but they didn't even really know what they were studying. It was nothing.
Right. Well, that's a topic for a whole other interview, which I
it is. Yeah. We don't want to stray off the subject too much, do we?
Right.
Yeah. So we're going to move on to Leary. He's LSD as well, isn't he? And obviously his connection to Do What Thou Wilt and all that. His
Timothy Leary, did you say?
Yeah, Timothy Leary. Can you tell us about meeting him and then what Charles Manson said about him? Because you obviously interviewed Charles Manson and you heard his thoughts on these people as well, didn't you? So
yeah, in 1976, when Timothy Leary got out of prison, some of your viewers may know, he had been arrested, and then the Weathermen, which was a group that actually extolled Manson and praised him after the murders. They
said it was crazy, didn't they? It was brilliant. They did it with their own forks and knives. They killed pigs with their own forks and knives. There's a quote from the Weathermen there about it. Yeah.
Bernadine Dorn, who was one of the leaders of the Weathermen, famously called it the Year of the Fork, celebrating the murders as a kind of revolutionary action. In any event, all of these people are connected one way or the other. And in any event, the weathermen helped Leary escape from prison in this very elaborate escape procedure. And Leary, who I strongly believe, from things he even said to me and others, was definitely as an asset to the Central Intelligence Agency. I have no doubt about that. He
admits it, doesn't he? He says there's later interviews where he says, "Oh, I couldn't have done anything without the CIA, the help of the CIA, and stuff like that."
He praised them all the time. He didn't even try to hide it, frankly. Now, I don't think he wasn't an agent, but he was an asset. And so then he was rearrested. Interestingly, he went to Eldridge Cleaver in North Africa for a while, and Eldridge Cleaver got sick of his narcissism and nonsense, which I can understand, having known Leary. And then, interestingly, Leary then went to Geneva for a while, in Switzerland, and to a skiing resort where he met Gene Gutowski, Polanski's patron and producer. And that led to Gene Gutowski giving Leary money when he was on the lam, when he was a fugitive from justice, for his book Autobiography of a Hope Fiend, or Diary of a Hope Fiend, which ties into what you're asking, based on Crowley's Diary of a Drug Fiend. So I met Leary in 1976, and I have always given him credit in our brief conversation at the Books West convention, which was a convention where authors were. I asked him, I said, because I'd read it in the papers, you were in prison with Manson. What was that like? And he said something to the effect of, nobody will ever really know what that whole case was about. He said Manson was railroaded. He praised him and said that guy was brilliant. He could have been, smarter than a professor at Harvard. And he spoke very highly of him, but he put the little seed in my mind, which led me down this fatal rabbit hole of there's some mystery about this case. You'll never know what it's really about. I didn't learn until later that Leary was married to one of the women an actress, one of the women who visited Cielo Drive, a friend of Sharon, with Joanna Pettit, and had lunch served by Winifred Chapman on the day of her murder. So I'm sure that's one of the reasons Leary knew so much about.
That's another crazy thing. I'd never heard that before, but because there were two actresses that she met with, and one of them was Timothy Leary's wife. Never knew that.
Right, and he was not married to her yet. He married her later, but I'm sure she told her,
obviously. Yeah.
I also believe Leary, because of his connections with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, must have known a lot about the narcotics trafficking and drug dealing that was going on. So then I got to know Leary later in the early 80s. I got to know him much better and was thoroughly disenchanted by him. I mean, at first I was impressed with his charm and his eloquence. But as I got to know him, I saw he was a pretty shallow, narcissistic, sociopathic, exploitive person. And the last time I met him, interestingly, was also 1987. The Wally George episode that I was in, which keeps being repeated endlessly, was shown at a nightclub in Los Angeles as part of an Amok book film showing, and Timothy Leary was there, and we met each other. And interestingly, at the time we saw each other the last time, we took a picture of each other, which I can send you. Maybe you can insert it.
With the magic of editing later.
Yeah, at the moment when we met, Psychic TV's cover version of Charlie's Never Say Never to Always was playing at that moment. So it's quite incredible how these synchronicities work.
That's the song the girls are singing as they're marching into court, in case people don't know. Yeah, that sounds kind of creepy when the girls are doing it.
This was a cover version that Peorage, another narcissist I knew and who also knew Leary, it was playing at the moment we took our final picture together. So it's very uncanny how these synchronicities emerge.
Yeah. And I was going to ask, yes, and what did Charlie say about Leary? Because you asked Charlie what he thought of Leary, didn't you? What did he say?
No. Well, interestingly, Leary spoke highly of Charlie, of his intelligence, of how he was railroaded, and Charlie absolutely despised Leary. He had nothing good to say about him. He said he should have been killed because he was a snitch.
Yeah.
I mean, from the criminal code perspective, Leary, the way that he got out of prison finally is because he snitched on all of
the FBI file on him is very revealing. He just handed everything over.
Yes,
gave them drawers full of evidence against the Weatherman. With no function whatsoever immediately.
At the time, people like Abby Hoffman and Allen Ginsberg and other countercultural figures denounced Leary completely, although he was somewhat rehabilitated before his death. But so Charlie looked at him as a snitch. I mean, he hated him. He would, when I brought up Leary, he ranted and raved about how much he prized him and how he betrayed the potential of the psychedelic movement. And he disagreed with him entirely. Now, Charlie did write an open letter to Leary in 1970, which was printed in the Los Angeles Free Press, in which he, kind of praised him. But then after he met him, he had a very negative impression of him.
Talk about Crowley now as well. What did Manson say about Crowley? Because there's also so much debate about whether he was a black magic practitioner of black magic, basically, and a black magician. But what did Charlie actually feel about Crowley and Thelema and these sorts of?
Well, I can preface that by saying the whole idea, Charlie was not interested in the whole Western occult ceremonial magic tradition whatsoever. But no offense to you and your countrymen, Charlie hated the English. This is something you have to understand. He was very pro-Irish and pro-Scottish, and he hated the English. And he didn't admire Aleister Crowley at all. Again, he had nothing good to say about him. There's nothing in his philosophy that shows the slightest influence of Thelema. And he wasn't impressed with any of these organized occult groups. He thought they were pompous and foolish play acting. He was a mystic. He was a shaman. He was not, in any traditional sense, an occultist who did rituals. And he was not in any way connected to this Golden Dawn Ordo Templi Orientis tradition, nor were any of the people in the commune. But Charlie had nothing good to say about him. And one Charlie would get these weird obsessive ideas that were not true, but he heard them somewhere. And I remember he would always say that Crowley died in a French whorehouse. And I would pedantically try to correct him and say, no, he died in a rooming house in Hastings. But
Brighton, I think Brighton, I'd always heard.
In Hastings.
Sure.
Hastings.
Yeah.
The place in Hastings. But in either case, he didn't have a positive idea about the British. And this is the important thing to keep in mind. He didn't admire the Beatles. He didn't have any interest in the Process Church or Robert de Grimston.
Yeah, we're going to get onto them in a minute. Yeah, the Process Church.
Right. He didn't. And he didn't admire anything about Crowley. And I think
again about the Beatles, because a lot of people don't realize this, because the Beatles were like teeny bopper music to Manson. He was in his early 30s, wasn't he? Like to him, they were like, He
was a guy in his early 30s with teenagers and girls in their early 20s listening to the most popular pop music of the time. So of course he heard their music, and anyone who knew Charlie would know he always had an opinion and an interpretation about everything. So if you played any record, he would say, this means that. I mean, he would interpret what clothes am I wearing? What does it mean symbolically? Everything. So he didn't care about the Beatles. The girls around him cared about it.
One observation I made as well, if you listen to those Leslie tapes, they're a nightmare to listen to because the sound's so bad. If you listen to her talk, she's saying, we thought this and we did that. And so it's all of them together. It wasn't just Charles Manson seeing all these things in the Beatles music. And she said, and then we went and got the Bible and we were looking at the book of Revelation and we're going, oh, wow. But she's not saying Charlie did all this. She's saying we. Like they were all doing it together as well. It was all their psychosis or whatever. It wasn't just Charlie.
It was a commune based on the idea of a collective hive mind. That was what they were trying to do, was have one mind. And Charlie was, of course, he was manipulative. Of course, he, as the older and more experienced person, he had a leadership position. There's no doubt about that. But it was more, and I think this is the most accurate way to characterize it, this psychological profile that was done. It was a group marriage. It was it was like you could go to LA today and you have an up and coming musician surrounded by young girls who think it's going to be the next big thing. It's nothing cult or cult like. It's an entourage, like the people around Andy Warhol or Frank Zappa.
And there's that Vito's it Polides or Polides, the name of he had a harem of women, always had a harem of women around him, didn't he?
Well, actually, Kim Fowley, who I knew in the 70s, told me that he believed, and Charlie did confirm that he knew of him, that he fashioned himself after him. The idea of having these girls as an entourage and going to concerts and dancing wildly. So his predecessor, they were called the freak out dancers. Go to Byrds concerts, and he knew Terry Melcher.
Very, very closely associated with Frank Zappa as well. People don't realize, but they were actually promo. That was promo. The bands hired them because it drew people into the venue. It made the show look exciting. People don't understand that about.
Well, the Byrds who were produced by none other than Melcher. They would have these freak out dancers come and look like they were spontaneously thrilled.
But they were really paid promotion. Like Michael Alig was a similar thing. The club kids in New York, they were promoters. They were actually nightclub promoters. They were paid to dress up like that and make the club look popping and exciting. They were there for that.
Oh, despite the
the same thing, the '60s version of it.
Despite the pretense that rock music was spontaneous and it was still the same old show business tricks that have been used in Hollywood since the Nickelodeon.
And so should we move on to the Process Church? Yes. What did Manson actually say to you about the Process Church? And did he ever discuss the interview when they interviewed him? Because they did interview Charles Manson in prison, didn't they? And they published his interview.
Well, you can see what he had to say in 1988 when I interviewed him the first time in Charles Manson Superstar. I mentioned to him, you lived on Cole Street, right near. Now, let me explain what this is that we're looking at. This is Process headquarters in London, in the Mayfair district, the very Hodge and Tony Mayfair district, and I am there with the late author Simon Wells, who was an expert on the process and who did a lot of very important research into Bruce Davis and his time in London. And Simon, to his credit, debunked the idea that that Bruce Davis was murdering anybody in London or anything like that. But again, that would lead us down another rabbit hole. But here we are portrayed in 2018 in front of Process headquarters in Mayfair.
And I just that other photo there was taken by Chris Stein from Blondie in either 1967 or 68, and that was their original door. You can see the cross onto the glass. But I've looked. There's definitely the same building. You can see the walls on either side and the stone around the door.
As I mentioned to you in another context, Chris Stein in the 80s once applied to be Zena's student. Gary Lockman, of course, who was an early member of Blondie, but he quit, and now he's an author of books about occultism and esoterica. Gary Lockman of Blondie attended this 88 Radio Werewolf rally in San Francisco and wrote about it in his book, Turn Off Your Mind, The Dark Side of the 60s. So, even Blondie, there's a kind of occult connection there.
I never realized they had so many occult connections because my mom loved them when I was a child. I remember hearing their music a lot. Gary Lackman's written books about Aleister Crowley and Madame Blavatsky, hasn't he? Interesting.
And so anyway, that house, manor house behind us was known. There was a place in it called
This was their
Lucifer.
headquarters in London, basically, wasn't it?
Yes, but also it had a coffee shop called Lucifer's, which tried to draw in people off the street, and they would show movies and have concerts and lectures. And I did find an advertisement, I think from 1967 or 8, where the process are showing Polanski films there.
Yeah.
But what did
what did Manson say though? Yeah, that was the question I asked you. Sorry. Yeah,
right. Well, in 1988, when I first asked him in my interview, you can see him say that I say, well, you lived on Cole Street, right near where the process San Francisco members were living. And I said, was there any connection? He said, no, that's a bunch of horse shit. And that's pretty much what he continued to say to me. He knew of them. You know, he knew a guy named Victor Wilde, who was a leather maker, who was a member of the process, but he was absolutely not influenced by the process, not interested in them. He barely knew anything about them when I asked questions. His philosophy and ideas were not influenced by Robert de Grimston. And in the Manson file, I have several pages of all of the commune members. Bobby Beausoleil said, I never heard of the process until I read about it in Ed Sanders' book. And Bobby Beausoleil was deeply connected to the whole occult.
Counterculture more than Manson even. You see him at the Human Being. There's photos of him, which is an iconic event now. It became an iconic event. They call it the Human Being. Loads of people got together and took acid in a park somewhere. And he was there, wasn't he? He was right in the middle of it. Oh, yeah.
Right. So Beausoleil is saying, and I believe him, I never even heard the process till I read Ed Sanders' book. Charlie said, and there is no sign of any influence. And one thing, without getting too complicated, Charlie's idea about Abraxas being God and the devil, that comes from Hermann Hesse and Carl Jung. It does not come from Robert de Grimston's idea. I think because people don't look into this very deeply, there's a bit of confusion about that. But there's really almost no point of comparison. If you really read Robert de Grimston's literature and compare it to Charlie's philosophy, there's, you know, he was not influenced by it. And the only person who's ever said there was a connection, and who knows what this is based on, is Patricia Krenwinkel. In one of her interviews said, I think we met de Grimston somewhere, but that's like the only little fragment of it. So
yeah, and they interviewed loads of people and that and they encouraged people to come into their cafes and that. So just because they met him, that doesn't mean they was getting taught by him or anything, does it? Do you know what I mean? Even if they did meet him once or twice, yeah.
Well, Bruce Davis, you know, was very involved in Scientology, and of course, you and I and other members of the Abraxas Circle went to Bruce Davis's hidden cottage in East Grinstead near the Scientology manor. Whether Davis visited the process in 1968, that is hard to say. He claimed in an interview with William Scanlon Murphy, who I also knew, that he did not know about the process. But I don't have any proof one way or the other. I find it hard to believe he would be in London and involved in Scientology and not have heard of the process.
This moves right to the question then, because Zena, you said that she interviewed de Grimston in the late 80s, did you say it was? And what did he say to Zena? This is the guy who founded the protest church. And in retrospect, what did he say about what the process church was really all about? This is interesting.
Right. When I was still writing this book, The Demonic Revolution, which is why I contacted LaVey and interviewed him, and Aquino and Stephen Flowers and the OTO, Kenneth Grant. I interviewed all of the occult leaders, Richard Ramirez. That's why I interviewed these people. We got the number of Robert de Grimston in Staten Island, the little island off of New York. And he was teaching there. He was teaching marketing. He was teaching how to present a brand, how to market your brand, which I think is very interesting. Because in my view, that's what the process was. It was marketing. It was advertising.
The magazine, the layout of it, people comment in the letters that it looks like someone with graphic design knowledge has made that magazine. That wasn't put together by someone who didn't know anything about graphic design,
Right, no. And that's one of the few real jobs I ever learned as a youth was graphic design. So I can say, yeah, the magazine was meant to draw young people in and make it look like slick, well-organized group, which it never was. It wasn't. It was a chaotic, shambolic mess, really. It wasn't very well organized, but the magazine was the lure. That was the draw. So anyway, yeah, Zena spoke to Robert de Grimston on the phone in 1989 or 90. I don't remember exactly which year. And he was completely dismissive of the process. He said it was he chuckled, and acted like, yeah, that was a youthful phase I went through. It's nothing I'm thinking about anymore. I don't think it was important. And if these conspiracy theorists and evangelical Christians who think the process was this incredible, powerful death cult that had its tentacles.
Getting an army of serial killers together, basically. This Maury Terry seems to have come up with this theory that they were getting an army of serial killers together, and Ramirez and Manson at the first part.
In the Son of Sam, I think that's all completely
nothing to back that up at all. No.
Right, and I've known people who were very much involved in the process. It was just a Scientology ripoff and self-help.
I did as deep an investigation as I could into them, searching for any criminal offence or violent offence associated with them, and there's nothing. If they were really these serial killers or whatever, surely they would have been caught for one violent offence somewhere, or something would have happened. But there's like vague stuff, like their cafe might have been a hangout for prostitutes or something like that. But no violence at all. It's like, if they really were these violent people, then surely they would have been caught for something, at some point.
One thing I've learned the hard way is you say that, and then the conspiracy theorists and evangelical Christians will say, well, that's because they were so powerful, they covered up all their crimes. So we have to admit, you can't win. These people
that's it,
it's an obsessive folk religion to them that the process is specter-like, incredibly sinister death cult. And I've seen no proof of it. And most importantly,
he's gone on to have an animal sanctuary, hasn't he? Because the German Shepherds, he's got a German Shepherd sanctuary or something. And I know the conspiracy theorists have put into that, saying, "Oh, this is the new cover for their death cult." They're just saying they're an animal sanctuary now. But they probably are just an animal sanctuary, mate. Calm down,
As far as I can see, it's a totally benevolent animal sanctuary.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, they just like dogs.
Right. Now, one important thing about that is that people who believe in this process church being an influence on the murders and all of that, and on Charlie's philosophy, they are falling for a trick of L. Ron Hubbard and his wife. L. Ron Hubbard set out to smear the process church of the Final Judgment because they were a splinter group from Scientology. And even the phrase process is stolen from Scientology. Basically, they stole L. Ron Hubbard's ideas and organizational principles and dressed them up with trendy occultism. Whereas Hubbard presented a more science fiction religion, they created a more hip and counterculture aimed at.
Can't get into Scientology. We've overrun, but it doesn't matter. What did Manson say to you about Scientology, and what did he ever say to you about Lanier? Just to explain to people who he is very briefly. He's the guy who said that he was in prison with Manson when he was younger, before the murders. And he was part of an LSD therapy experiment, and he freaked out and ended up in the hole. And when he came back, he'd had a personality change. And he's the guy who's also a Scientologist. That's who Lanier is.
Right. Yeah. So, he never mentioned him by name. But he did read what I wrote about him in the Manson file and approved it, as he did whatever I wrote in this last edition. If he had a correction, he would tell me. So he didn't argue with what I said about Raymer in the Manson file. But the only time he referred to him specifically, when I first asked him about Scientology and whether it really had as much influence on him as the media has made it sound like, he said that a crazy guy kept preaching to him about Scientology in his cell. He shared a cell with Raymer. And at first, he was very enthusiastic about Scientology and Dianetics, and even identified himself to the prison as a Scientologist. But then he said this guy kept endlessly, obsessively talking about Dianetics and Hubbard. And he got so sick of it, he asked the staff, can you please move me to another cell so I can get away from this guy? So if you can imagine someone so crazy and annoying that even Charlie had.
Charles Manson couldn't handle it. Yeah, that's the thing, probably. Yeah. And also the story of him going to the hole, that might be an exaggeration. He really did just ask to be moved out of this guy's cell because he was doing his head in. He didn't really get sent.
No, he wasn't put in the hole. He didn't really have any. Charlie didn't have a lot of disciplinary issues in that. He was really trying to behave himself somewhat.
The thing they say is though he had a big breakdown because of acid, some kind of bad reaction to acid, and they didn't know what to do with him, so they threw him in the hole.
No, he did not have LSD until he got out of prison in 1967. That's nonsense. First time he had acid was at the Avalon Ballroom when he saw the Grateful Dead on Easter of 1967. He did not ever have LSD in prison. That's nonsense.
No.
He had experimented with psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico as early as 1960. But he told me many times of what an incredible effect LSD had on him when he took it at the Avalon Ballroom during a Grateful Dead concert. So I don't believe that at all, that he ever had any LSD in.
Yeah, well, this is one thing that gets me. If that is true, Manson would have said that every time anyone put a microphone in front of him, like, oh yeah, the shrink in the prison gave me LSD. You know, that would be one of the things he would have talked about. He would not be able to keep that in, you know.
That's a very good point, and this is one of the things that I have stressed. If the CIA or anyone, he did complain to me many times that when he was in Vacaville in the early 80s, they forced these drugs on him. So, you know, antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine and all that. He bitched about it constantly. If they had done experiments on him with LSD, he'd be, like you say, he'd be screaming it to the mountaintops. He would not have kept it. But again, arguing with these fanatics who believe in all the MK Ultra nonsense. But I will just underscore, Charlie did not experiment or use LSD until Easter of 1967, when he was already out of prison.
Yeah. So should we go to like the final question now, just to talk generally? So in your view, how much of the Manson occult mythology survived serious scrutiny, and how much was made projection after the murders? So that's all of it.
I think almost all of it was projection after the murders, caused by, first of all, the sensational way that the media treated it, even before the crimes were solved, suggesting that it was connected to occultism.
The very first headlines were ritual slaying and that, weren't they? I've looked at all the media reports and that. Yeah, they from the very beginning, they were calling it a ritualistic slaying and stuff like that, weren't they?
Right. So precisely. So the media already set it up falsely as a black magic ritual of some kind. They, even in Newsweek, they were talking about voodoo. So even before the commune were arrested and Tex and Linda and these people were arraigned and indicted, the media was already falsely presenting it as an occult crime because of Polanski's movie Rosemary's Baby and all of this sensational nonsense, because they didn't know.
Ed Sanders as well. He was interested in the occult's influence on the counterculture, wasn't he? And he wrote. I don't know if it was published, but if you look at the Ed Sanders file, there's the manuscript of a book he wrote about occult and the counterculture.
Well,
so this was something he was researching. He wanted to write a book about it, and so this is why he tried to connect the Process Church to the family.
Well, I will get
interested in the occult and that. Yeah.
I get into this in great detail in the documentary that I'm making at this moment. But Ed Sanders is largely responsible. Also, a book called Satan's Slaves that came out in Britain very early, in even before the trial began, connected it to the Process and occultism. But the guy who wrote it was a hack writer who did no original research, knew nothing about it. And Ed Sanders, he wanted to distance Charlie and the commune from the counterculture by saying, no, it's not, they're not hippies. They're these weird occultists. They're Satanists. They this is not the counterculture. So he had an agenda in presenting it that way. And of course, he was sued by the Process Church He was
Yeah, and
sued.
Esquire magazine they sued as well because they published that the Process Church were connected to it. They sued Esquire and its owners, publisher, and him. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an issue of Esquire magazine that came out that very pushed the occult angle. So yeah, this is people want everything to be more fascinating and flamboyant and larger than life is.
And you can drive yourself nuts trying to find connections that don't exist. Like, so just in case anyone researching this is watching this who needs to hear it, don't drive yourself nuts looking for connections for these things that don't exist.
Yeah, having known people in all of these groups, the OTO, Church of Satan, the Process, and many other occult organizations, all I can say is conspiracy theorists and evangelical Christians who view the world through this Abrahamic lens of this huge battle between good and evil are wildly overestimating the power and influence of these occultists who could hardly organize their own groups properly, let alone these gigantic conspiracies. So
this clearly it had more to do with drugs and just the breakdown of the moral boundaries of society because people were going too far with the do what thou wilt aspect of it. We haven't said it here, but in the presentation I'm going to do before this, I'm going to explain how, like, if you've got a decent moral bounds, do what thou wilt is okay. If you're a good person who cares if you hurt people, then you wouldn't, would you? But if you're a bit of a psycho and you don't care about people and you live do what thou wilt, you're going to go too far, aren't you? And this is what we saw in society, you know.
Well, to a certain extent, Harold True, who anyone who knows about this case will know who he was. He said, Charlie said to people, do what feels right to you, do what feels good. And he said, if you tell that to a bunch of psychotics, then what are they going to do?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is it. And that's what happened. You know, people were losing it on psychedelic drugs. People were too young to have had proper moral boundaries anyway. You know, these were kids, weren't they? They didn't know fully. They were 18, 19, 20. Yeah, they're legally, they were old enough to understand right from wrong, weren't they? Yeah.
Well, to be devil's advocate, was the establishment that condemned them moral? Nixon and
that's it, isn't it?
And his war crimes.
They actually said in court as well, didn't they, about Vietnam War? Look how many people you've killed in Vietnam. Are we as bad as you or whatever? Yeah, that's it.
I think we have to be careful not to buy the Republican attitude of the time that the hippies were morally depraved and that was the problem in America, which was a deflection from the incredible criminality and corruption and war crimes of the Nixon administration and the Nixon administration before that, and JFK. I mean, was the establishment ethical and moral? No, not at all.
So. Bobby Kennedy as well. Find out stuff about Bobby Kennedy. He wasn't a nice guy, really. He was quite a horrible guy. Probably kill Marilyn Monroe was actually there. They said that it was debunked. He could have been in LA, but they're now showing actually he was flown in and flown out again quickly. And
I've done a lot of research on Bobby Kennedy. I believe that he literally murdered. The Attorney General of the United States literally murdered Marilyn Monroe. So was the establishment so wonderful? No, I don't think so.
No. Yeah. Well, so like I say, this has gone on for 48 minutes now. And I am going to do another better interview with you that's more autobiographical. Because as soon as I said I was going to interview you, people were saying, ask him about Adam Parfrey and So, that's autobiographical stuff. I'll do a longer interview where I ask you about all this sort of stuff. This was purely focused on your views on anger and.
I'm more interested. I'm more interested in discussing my work than my life, but we can get into it to the extent that it is relevant. So, thank you for inviting me. And we will speak soon.
Yeah, we'll speak soon. So I'll end the recording.